Hello, everybody. Welcome to PlantStock. Without further ado, I want to introduce our keynote speaker, Owen Williams. This is the year of the meadow, and he specializes in planting meadows. He's come up from DC, from the DC area, to in part to see family, but also to speak here. So, Owen, are you ready? Okay, here we go.
Okay.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you. So thank you for the introduction, Marshall, and thanks for the invitation to be here. I really appreciate it, and it's so nice to see everybody coming out for this. I think it's a great idea, and like Marshall said, it's long overdue. I did come up from Washington, D.C., where I live now, but I actually grew up in the house literally right next door to the farm here, and my parents are here in the audience. So because of that, I went to school with Sean Pilger, who's the manager of the farm here, and I've come back, every year and really love this community. So I'm really happy to see that this initiative is happening and the movement for native plants and rewilding is kind of taking off on Long Island. So that's a little bit about who I am. I work, my background is in ecology. I'm an ecologist, and I work in the Washington, D.C. area for the Fairfax County Park Authority, where I manage the ecological restoration program. So my approach to native plantings, native plant landscaping, meadow creation, all that stuff comes from an ecology background, and everything I do attempts to reforge those connections in the ecosystem between what's in our yard or what's in our gardens and what's in nature around us. So that's kind of my approach to everything. And I apologize, I'm going to refer to my notes here because I don't have a PowerPoint presentation to offer to you guys. So I'll start off by just talking a little bit about what a meadow is and what the ecology is of a meadow, and then I'll get down to talking about what some of the benefits are and how to make one. A meadow is something that's a semi-cultivated space that contains both grasses and forbs, which is just another word for flowering plants. And it's kind of a term that's used loosely and generally to refer to grassy spaces. So, you could refer to the field back behind you guys where they sometimes keep the sheep as a meadow, and often it is associated with livestock, sheep and that type of thing that are grazers. You could refer to an open field here, when the cars aren't parked here. You could refer to that as a meadow, even though most of the grasses here are sort of traditional turf grasses or European cool season grasses that are traditionally for livestock in Europe that were brought over with European settlers to the United States or to the American continent. And then to contextualize that a little bit more, we can think about a meadow as something that's on a grassland continuum. A grassland is sort of an umbrella term that includes all kinds of ecosystems that are dominated by grass. So you have things that are really wild, like prairies in the Midwest and savannas, and then you have things that are semi-cultivated, which is a pretty wide range of things like what we would call a meadow. And then you have things that are entirely cultivated, like a lawn, like a straight-up turf grass lawn that you might find in suburban Long Island, for example. So we can think about these things on that kind of a continuum, and a meadow is sort of, as I think of a meadow, is sort of right in the middle of that. But whenever I'm working on planting a meadow, I'm always thinking about it from the wild side, the prairie side. What would this look like if it was a prairie? What are the potential connections that a prairie in this location would have with wildlife, or with other plants, or with the forest around it, or with rain and the water cycle, or with carbon and carbon sequestration? So I try to think about all of those things together, and then create recommendations for how to either create a meadow in this space or manage a meadow that already exists. So these truly wild spaces like prairies are things that are high in diversity, lots of different types of plants, and they have a lot of connections to wildlife. There's all kinds of animals that will use those spaces for forage, for food, for cover, for hiding during the winter, for escaping from predators. The predators themselves have adaptations to figure out how to catch things that use those prairies as hiding spaces. And then, so we can use that as our model when we create a meadow in our domesticated spaces. So if we're talking about the 1,000-yard campaign, and you're looking to create something in your backyard in Bellport, or if you've got a larger space somewhere on Long Island, you can think about all those connections and how you can maximize that for the most environmental benefit that you could create. And Long Island itself historically has had prairie. The sandy soils here left from glaciation were really supportive of that. Prairies are extremely drought tolerant, and with a really sandy soil like what Long Island has, you can suffer from drought easily. And so these prairie systems, there was something, as I read, something like 40,000 acres of natural prairie on Long Island before that they were converted into other forms of land use like agriculture and livestock pastures and eventually urban development as well. So it is historically ecologically accurate for prairies and meadows to exist on Long Island. One other note about grasslands is, in general, sorry about that. Ecosystems in general are constantly changing. They're constantly turning into something else and reorganizing themselves. So, for example, the spaces in between the cultivated rows on the farm, you may think those are, throwaway waste spaces, but in fact they're constantly reorganizing themselves, and you may look weedy, but those are just the plants that are organizing themselves to take that space up. And likewise, if you stopped cultivating your garden, it would reorganize itself into something else, which might be things that you don't want, like weeds, but that's kind of how that works. And so with a wild space like a prairie or even a meadow, these places are organizing themselves as well. And we, as humans, intervene in that process at different points, and we can stop it from changing and maintain the status quo. And so that's kind of what you're doing in a garden, is you're weeding or you're mulching or you're cutting things down or you're transplanting or replanting something, and you're trying to maintain the status quo of your garden. And that's what's happening in these wild spaces as well, is as time goes on and it rains and new plants germinate, these grassland systems will turn into shrubland systems where you have shrubs and you might have thickets of blackberry or other plants, and then eventually that will turn into forest. So especially in the eastern United States, there's enough rainfall and the climate is such that you can have these grassland systems eventually turn into forested systems, and then they've then reorganized themselves, and that had nothing to do with us unless we intervene at these different points. So you could intervene right away and say mow a grassland system, and you would keep out the trees from growing in, or you could allow some trees to grow and then start mowing later, and then you might have something like a savanna, which is still dominated by grass, but it's sort of pockmarked by trees. You might have, say, 5 to 10 trees per acre for a sort of savanna that was kind of sparse. Or if you get into a meadow situation, you may be disturbing it every year or every season by having sheep graze on it. And then with a lawn, you're disturbing that every 2 weeks by mowing it, or every week, or however frequently that is, which I don't really know because I don't have a lawn. So, so that kind of disturbance will favor certain types of plants to grow there, which these turf grasses that are traditionally in a lawn they've been found over decades to be the ones that tolerate that. So that's why those particular grasses are the ones that we have in a lawn. Yeah. Okay, so I'll talk a little bit about sort of you can sort of think about pros and cons of having a meadow or having a grassland or having a lawn. And there's different pros and cons depending on if you're thinking about it from a human point of view or from a natural point of view, and in terms of nature. And some of the benefits for people, one of the most obvious ones that I think of is aesthetics. They're colorful. They have interesting different shapes and textures. They feel different. They smell different. They have plants that grow at all different times of the season, and then they look interesting. Their seeds look interesting during the winter. The grasses that are golden during the winter that have little fluffy seeds hanging off of them. So they have all these really great aesthetic interests. And that can also lead to community building, because people may take an interest in what you've got in your yard, if you've allowed it to grow up in this way, and they may stop and say hello to you or talk about it, or I think some of the efforts that are represented here today speak to that, and the fact that everybody is here right now listening to me talk, I think is also a testament to that as well. Another benefit of meadows is the reduced reliance on inputs such as gasoline and fertilizer and pesticide and water. And with less mowing, for example, there's less emissions, and it's less costly to maintain. I think I read that there are 40 million acres of lawn in the United States, and it takes something like 800 million gallons of gas to mow those lawns every year. So if you think about that from a climate change point of view, and mitigating that's a lot of gasoline that could be reduced, and a lot of emissions that could be reduced, and a lot of potential respiratory concerns that could be reduced as well. There's also connections that can be made with wildlife that are really beneficial to nature, and I think to people as well. Like I already mentioned, birds will take up cover in these places. They'll cover in the winter. They'll nest in the summer. They'll find food. You'll have small mammals that can find food from the seeds. Of course, pollinators will love the density of wildflowers and the concentration of nectar and pollen that you can find there. In addition to pollination services that those insects provide, they also rely on them for host plants for their larval form. So caterpillars rely on having grass foliage and wildflowers, and they specialize on different plants, so having a diversity of plants really benefits them as well. I've done meadow projects where I came back after 6 months after planting, and I found baby box turtles in there. I've found small animals, or small mammals, rabbits, snakes, all kinds of things seem to really take up residence in these places. And they can be small too. 2,500 square feet is not a large meadow, but you can find some of these animals taking up residence there. I think it's really fascinating. Which is not to mention, on a larger space, you can have things like wild turkeys nesting, and birds of prey and things like that as well. And then there's some processes that these meadows, some ecosystem functions or processes that they also provide benefits for us and for nature, and that includes things like preventing erosion, capturing stormwater runoff, reducing soil compaction, the root action of these prairie plants. These prairie plants have gigantic roots. There's a great illustration of this where a certain plant, one of the example plants is Indian grass, which is a native grass to this area and also grows in the Midwest and the prairies. And the thing has, the foliage stands, the flower head stands about this high, about 6 feet high during the summer when it's at full growth, but then its roots penetrate something like 8 feet down under the ground. And if you think about the amount of plant material that's being generated by that single individual Indian grass, it's producing all these roots every year. They die back a little bit in the winter, and then it produces a new flush of roots in the summer, or in the following growing season. And as those roots decompose, they're producing soil. So you're actually gaining soil, and that's why those soils in the Midwest were so deep, is because these plants had been growing there for millennia, and had been building up the soil. So you're not only accumulating soil, but you're creating soil that's healthier. You're creating soil that can be inhabited by soil microorganisms, worms, grubs, other larval forms of insects and invertebrates. So they do amazing things for the soil as well. And further on the question of the root mass that these plants are growing is they're sequestering carbon in the soil, which is actually a more stable form of carbon than you even get in a mature forest. So forest trees eventually die and fall over and release their carbon back into the atmosphere to some degree, whereas these prairie plants that are storing the carbon from their roots underground, it gets sequestered into that soil, and that's really stable, and that can stay there for thousands of years. All right, so I've told you a little bit about what I think is great about meadows, and so I'll just sort of roughly outline what it's like to make a meadow. And every situation is going to be different. Everybody's yard is going to have a slightly different situation, so it really requires a custom approach. But one of the things that I think is really important and that I do in my work is I take an ecological approach to it. And you've probably heard this term rewilding, and that's using natural processes to allow a space to go from cultivated to uncultivated, and in so doing, bringing with it all those benefits that I've been talking about here. And sometimes it's a really gentle approach. It's a form of ecological restoration, and it could be as simple as just stop mowing. You may have a space that has native plants in it, but because you're mowing, you don't see them. It just looks like a lawn. But if you stop mowing, these plants may re-emerge, and you may end up with something that looks great and has a lot of native plant diversity. And if that's what you're after, if all you need to do is stop mowing, then that's sort of a form of rewilding. So I like that ecological approach to it. The other thing about it is doing it that way, you have the highest chance of success by taking that slower approach and not just completely, dropping a nuclear bomb on your lawn or on your property and starting over from absolute zero and requiring that you bring in seeds and plants and genetic stock from somewhere else. You may have it there on site already, and that's the best thing to take advantage of if you can. So in a way, you're using the weeds, the quote-unquote weeds that you may have. And to talk about weeds a little bit, a definition of a weed is really just a plant that's growing in a place where you don't want it to grow. And that could be a native plant, it could be a non-native plant, it could be a really aggressive plant, it could be a not very aggressive plant, but it's just defined on what the use of that site is and what you want there and what you don't. And so sometimes weeds are good things and you don't even know it, and then they become not weeds anymore. So that can be a really interesting transformation. Okay, so usually the first step in creating a meadow, let's assume for the moment that we're talking about a yard in a suburban environment. Maybe it's about the size of the space that we're using right now here for this event, or maybe smaller. And usually the first step in creating a meadow is to remove the vegetation that you've already got. So if you've got turf grass or an old garden bed that you don't want anymore, you need to remove that. You need to also remove any invasive plants. If you've got things like mugwort or lespedeza or wineberry, there's all kinds of invasive plants, which I think Marshall is going to talk about a little later. And you've got to get rid of those before you start building a meadow, or they're going to plague you the whole time, and they plague you the entire time, and they create a risk that your meadow could fail. Turf grasses like tall fescue and Kentucky bluegrass are, in my opinion, invasive species, and weeds for that matter. So those are important to get rid of because they grow in such a way as they will overwhelm any kind of meadow plants that you attempt to seed onto your property. There's a variety of different methods that you can use to remove things, and especially if you're using seed, it can be really tricky, and you've got to sequence them and time them very, very carefully. I'm not against using herbicide in these cases where you've got really difficult, aggressive, invasive plants. So sometimes that's the simplest and easiest and most effective way to control the weeds and the lawn. I'm happy to talk about that with anybody who would like to talk more about that later. I know it's a controversial subject, but I have used it with success, and I feel like as long as you use it in a limited way, we call it integrated pest management, where you use as little of it as you need to use, and you're careful about it. I do feel like it can be effective and safe and compatible with the environmental benefit that you're trying to produce by creating a meadow. There's other things that you can do without the use of herbicide, like solarization, which is laying clear plastic over your lawn and allowing it to basically cook in the sun over the summer, and it will kill the grass that's there, and it will kill the seed bank afterwards, and that creates a good starting point. You can also do things like rototill or plow or disc if you've got access to farm equipment, or if you can rent something from, a hardware store. That has some caveats with it as well, which I'm happy to talk about in more detail. You sort of get really down into the weeds, so to speak, about how to carry these things out. And then once you've controlled the space, the vegetation that was already there, and you have either a prepared seed bed for seeding, or you've prepared the space for live plantings, then you go ahead and plant. And there's a variety of different seasons that you can do that in, which I'm sure most of you know. Fall and spring are really great for planting. As we get warmer winters seem to be okay too, as long as the ground doesn't freeze. But one thing that I think is really important, and I try to implement in my practice as well, is to use local genetic stock. So using not only native plants, but also native plants that are from genetic stock that's local to your area. So I think it's really great that the Long Island Native Plant Initiative is here, because they do this, and I would look to them first if I was going to try to plant a native plant garden. And the reasons for that are that if you collect seed from local wild populations, the genetic stock of those what you're propagating, the propagules, are going to be wild and uncultivated, and that's what we need. And they have the greatest genetic diversity, which means that they'll have the greatest chance that means that not only will they have the greatest chance for success growing in this environment, in these soils, in this climate, but also it preserves the genetic identity of our home, and the natural heritage of Long Island and the surrounding areas is preserved, and we preserve a greater amount of genetic diversity in these plant populations than we would have if we were importing material from places like Minnesota, which I love Minnesota. I have nothing against it. I have nothing against the plants that they grow there. But if you're importing stuff from Minnesota to grow in Long Island, not only is it a different climate, but you're bringing in diversity that evolved in Minnesota rather than diversity that could be available right here that evolved in Long Island. So I think that's really important, and I try to carry that as much as I can. Sometimes you're restricted and you can't do that. Not every place has that kind of a local plant nursery. There's a great one down in Washington, D.C. that I use all the time called Earth Sangha, and I recommend them very highly. So I think that's something important to think about when you're doing some native plantings. So then once you've planted your meadow, sometimes you need to, if you've planted it from seed, sometimes you need to keep an eye on it over the summer, and you may need to do some trimming to slow down the fast-growing plants and allow the slow-growing plants to keep up. Otherwise, they may be overwhelmed, and you may wind up with just one or two species that dominate the meadow and overtake everything. So that's important. And then the key thing with seeding is you have to be really patient. And it may seem like your seeding has failed, but in fact, by the end of the year, you may have plants that are only this big, and that may be a 100% success. Sounds like I'm probably running out of time, but no. Oh, okay. Anyway, so you may have plants that are only this big after a season, and that could be a tremendous success, depending on the situation, not in all cases. But I would look on that favorably. And then the following year, they may actually grow up into something that's as tall as they typically grow at maturity and bloom and things like that. But these native plants put so much development in their first year into their roots that they don't always grow up above ground as much. And that provides them a really good starting point for the following season. So that's why we trim sometimes, because some of our most important prairie plants will only get this big, 3 to 4 inches tall after a season of growth. So that's why we need to trim sometimes those other fast-growing species in order to give those little guys, to allow them to continue to access sunlight and space to grow. And then, I can't emphasize enough the importance of being patient for that year. And they look much better the second year, much more like what we would expect. And hopefully you have built a relationship with your neighbors so they understand that you haven't just created a mess with no plan. Because, some neighbors may not like that. They may not understand what you're doing. And sometimes all you have to do is have a conversation and people get it. And, as we can see, there's tons of people here right now, which is so fantastic. That the good word is getting out, and the more that you spread it, the more that people will be interested. So thanks for that. Thanks for coming and for being interested in that. I think that's about all I've got. So thank you so much for listening, and I hope this is helpful, and feel free to get in touch with me if I can help.
Very little is going to rival that. Really, just so much great information. At this point, we're just going to mingle around and get to know each other, get to know the plants. And 3:10, we'll have Mark Rauch speak briefly about what's going on in Bellport. Thanks, everybody, for coming. And this is going to be a perennial event.
Hello everybody, my name is Julia. I'm with the H.O.G, and I just want to thank everybody who's never been here before. Thank you. Thank you for coming to Brookhaven Hamlet. Thank you for visiting our little slice of heaven here. We have beverages over here. There's some beer, water, and iced tea. Please help yourselves. And please hold on for the most amazing singer-songwriter, Mel Morin, who will be up after our talk in a little bit.
This is Marshall.
Pleasure. Hi.
Nice to meet you.
Thank you. Yeah, great meeting you.
Yeah.
Thanks, Marshall. I feel like I'm at an official press conference of some kind with these microphones in front of me. But I am the chair of the Bellport Environment Committee. That is the Environment Committee of the Bellport Village government. And I want to thank Marshall Brown and the Long Island Conservancy for bringing together all of these terrific vendors, exhibitors, organizations, and so forth into just an amazing event that also happens to be perfectly aligned with the mission of our 1,000 Yards campaign, which is what I'm going to be talking about today. And our 1,000 Yards booth is right back to my left over there. The story of the 1,000 Yards campaign, can everybody hear me, by the way? Yes, okay. The story actually begins more than a decade ago when Superstorm Sandy cut a large channel through Fire Island, okay? And we refer to that as the breach. And what it did is it allowed the waters of the Atlantic Ocean twice a day, when the tides rose and fell, to come into Bellport Bay and to cleanse Bellport Bay. And, there's an old saying that it's an ill wind that blows nobody good. Well, sure enough, it soon became apparent that Bellport Bay was much cleaner than it had been before, and that there were fewer algae blooms, red tides, brown tides, fish kills, and whatnot. And conversely, there were far more fish, good aquatic plants, and birds that inhabit that environment. So generally speaking, Bellport Bay, after Superstorm Sandy with the breach, was much healthier and cleaner than it had been before. That was the good part. Okay. Now, a few years ago, observers started to notice that the breach was silting up. And in fact, It was declared officially closed in December of 2022, last year. So that means that we could no longer rely on the Atlantic Ocean to help keep our bay clean and healthy, that we had to take on the responsibility ourselves. And now, I think that most of you know that a major cause for the harmful consequences of pollution in Bellport Bay is nitrogen. Okay, and one source of excess nitrogen, not the only source, of course, but one significant source is fertilizer used on lawns, and especially high nitrogen, quick release fertilizer. And what that type of synthetic fertilizer does is it leaches right down into the groundwater, and Bellport Village, and it's also true of Brookhaven Hamlet here, all of it is close enough to the bay so that everything that you put on your lawn eventually winds up in the bay and harming aquatic life and plant life there. So if it doesn't get there by going through the groundwater, it gets there much more quickly when the rain comes, like it did yesterday afternoon. And the rain sweeps the synthetic fertilizer right off the lawns into the storm drains, and those go right into the bay. So we had to do something about that. So that is the first main goal. We have two main goals of the 1,000 Yards campaign. And what we did is we asked people not to protect the bay. That is our first main goal. And to do that by using low nitrogen, slow release fertilizer on their lawns, if you use any fertilizer at all. We're not saying don't use any, but use organic, slow release, low nitrogen fertilizer, and not to use herbicides or pesticides, because those are highly toxic chemicals that don't do any of the life in the bay any good either. So our complete guide to bay-friendly lawn care is right in this booklet that we published in April of 2023 on Earth Day. And there are copies of it back there, and you can also get it, you can find it online, and we can tell you how to do that, okay? And it contains a link to a website where there's a constantly changing list of fertilizers that are low nitrogen, slow release fertilizers that are available in stores or online. So the lawn care section of our guide also outlines several methods for keeping your lawn green and healthy without using harmful chemicals that pollute the bay. And that brings me to the second main goal of the 1,000 Yards campaign. And our Environment Committee is very concerned about the drastically declining populations of birds, butterflies, bees, and other insects. In other words, the pollinators that are really vital here on Earth. And without them, our food chains would collapse and life on Earth really would not be possible. So the second goal of two of our 1,000 Yards campaign is to create habitat in our yards for all of these creatures. And that's what ties most directly into all of these exhibitors and vendors and so forth that are here today. Because the way you create habitat for these creatures is by planting native plants, which they are accustomed, they are ecologically related to, and native trees. And again, if you look at in our booklet, the second and third sections of our booklet show you many different ways to incorporate native plants in your yard. And we ask people to remove at least some of their lawn. It's up to you how much, because every yard is different. It might be a small square. It might be 10,000 square feet if you have that kind of yard. But remove a small part of your, not as Owen said, not particularly environmentally helpful turf grass, and replace it with a pollinator garden or other native plants. And this booklet shows you many different ways to do that. And it also recommends, if you want to plant a native tree, 11 different native trees that are actually suited to this particular area. They're hyper-local, if you will, and they're very likely to thrive here in what we'll call the South Country area, okay? So How do you become a member of the 1,000 Yards campaign? Basically, you do two things. The first is you promise not to use the bad chemicals on your lawn and to take care of your lawn in an organic way. And that's a going forward promise. The second thing you do is you either plant a native tree, and it's your choice. It could be one of those 11 that we recommend or another native tree. Or you take out a part of your lawn and you replace it with some native plants. And if you do that, if you do A and B, you get a beautiful, durable, elegant yard sign like this. So to show your to show your pride, really, at being a friend of the environment, a friend of the bay, a friend of the precious pollinators. So I want to close by just mentioning that there's a group in East Hampton known as Change Hampton that has now created a program very similar to ours, and it's called 1,000 Healthy Yards. It was launched at Guildhall in East Hampton, but more importantly, our friends and neighbors here in Bellport, where's Julia? Julie, come on up here. Our friends and neighbors here in Brookhaven, Hamlet, have decided to create their own similar program, working with us, called 1,000 More Yards. They're going to launch that in 2024, and I'm going to turn the microphone over to Julia for a minute to talk about that.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you. Thank you, Bellport Environmental Committee, for all of the work that you've done on this project, this initiative. It is amazing, and we cannot wait to unroll it here for our own residents who have been asking Bellport, how do we get our signs? So we're really happy to provide that. My name is Julia Villacara. I am the Quality of Life Chairperson for the Brookhaven Village Association. This association has been around for 117 years, making improvements here in the hamlet and also preserving what we have. And it is much greater board members that have come before me that for everything you see here, we owe it all to them. So as part of the Brookhaven Village Association, we also have a plantings committee. For the last 20 years, we have planted over 250 native trees here in the hamlet as part of our beautification process. And we are very much looking forward to incorporating 1,000 more yards for our residents to be able to make the choice of how they want to support the bay and our wildlife and our waters. So again, thank you all for being here today. Outside of my role on the Brookhaven Village Association, I would just like to say that this election cycle, the environment is very much on the ballot. So please help yourselves in the back. There are signs to make for your lawn, for our lawns, supporting the environment. Please do that. And thank you all for being here today.
The growers that are here today will be very much a part of the rewilding of all these different communities. 1,000 yards, 1,000 more yards, the rewilding people in Port Washington. It's amazing just how much has been going on in parallel and how everything seems to be happening at once. There's one topic, though, I just want to bring up briefly, and then we can get back to mingling and buying the plants. The Dirty Dozen campaign. We launched this with the town of North Hempstead, the Science Museum of Long Island, and Sands Point Preserve about a month and a half back. There's a dozen in particular that we named. They're all on the sign back there. Long Island is losing a battle it doesn't even know it's fighting, and unless we get on top of the invasive plant problem, we absolutely must. We have to talk to our public officials about it. They don't understand it. Landscapers have to be part of the solution. There's too much. We need an army to take care of this. Who has Japanese knotweed on their property? There's okay. Oriental bittersweet, porcelain berry, English ivy. English ivy. You see it everywhere. People think it looks classy. Well, it is a vector for Lyme disease. Let me explain why. It provides ground cover for the white-footed mouse. The white-footed mouse is actually what infects the ticks in the first place. So actually, the ticks carry all these diseases because the mice have it. So with the English ivy, the predators can't find the mice, and so and then the ivy is a nice warm blanket for the ticks to overwinter. Same thing with Japanese barberry, which was made illegal to sell or plant in New York in 2015. Yet I walked by a new Starbucks in Sayville and they had it all over the place. So yeah, so enforcement is also a problem. So just get rid of it in your yard, and you're saving trees elsewhere. And maybe someday we'll be able to walk in our forests again without having to worry about coming down with one of these diseases. But it's really something just how one plant can disrupt a whole ecosystem. So on that downbeat note, yes, please enjoy the rest of your time here. This has been a small miracle, and it's all because of you. Thank you.